Hello, everyone. Let's look at our third reading. This is chapter 2 of Mary Wollstonecraft's 1792 book, Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Wollstonecraft was an Englishwoman who was living in France during the ongoing tumult and changes of the French Revolution, which had started a few years earlier in 1789, the date of the publication of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And she was a British radical in many ways. Very interesting, Mary Wollstonecraft, her life and work. This is the first line from chapter 2 of her book. To account for and excuse the tyranny of man, many ingenious arguments have been brought forward. Now, this is a little out of context. The tyranny of man there is the tyranny of man over woman. And, which is, I think, again, what I like to do in these videos is give you the part of the text that I thought was most compelling or most challenging or most fruitful for me, and what really gripped me and said this needs to be read. This idea that men tyrannize over women this is the thought here. So the tyranny of man is not some abstract or floating tyranny of man. It's a tyranny is always somebody over somebody else, somebody tyrannizing over somebody else. And the tyrant here is man, and the victim of the tyranny is woman in general. So the claim here is that, at least in 1792, generally speaking, men tyrannize over women. And that is a very strident claim, and it is extremely interesting. We should think about what tyranny means, because I think that is important for understanding what she is doing. Looking for different definitions of tyranny, but my favorite one comes from John Locke, who's a bit of whose work we'll be reading later on, his ideas on property. But in the second treatise of government, he defines tyranny as the exercise of power beyond right. So a tyrant, classically speaking, a tyrant is a word that was developed comes from ancient Greek, and it is a way of describing someone who is the sole ruler of a city. But I think that the difference between a tyrant, essentially, and a king is that a tyrant is somebody who has power, who simply has power, whereas a king would be somebody who's given power legitimately. So the accusation of tyranny here is that men exercise power over women beyond right, and that is her argument, right? That has to be her argument, I think. That is proving that men's exercise of power over women has no legitimate foundation, that they are exercising a power over which they have no right to, which is the Locke idea, right? Now, the classic idea of a monarchy is that the monarch becomes the monarch by being descended from the previous monarch, at least the closest in line, and that ultimately that line is legitimated by divine authority. That's the idea of monarchy, the basic idea of monarchy. So what Wollstonecraft, I think, wants to prove in this book most essentially is that the exercise of power that men perform over women, socially, politically, culturally, physically, economically, is not a kingship. That is not a legitimate power. It's a tyranny. That is, it's a power that is exercised beyond right. So much of her book, I think, is really trying to prove that. That is, it may surprise you, some of the things that she says, some of the admissions she makes about women in her time, and their faults as she sees them, and their weaknesses as she sees them. And you'll see that much of this chapter, and I think much of the book, has to do with education and women being harmed by their lack of access to real education. The education that women gets turns them into something faulty in her mind, and that she has to prove that they have the same status morally, intellectually as men, so that that power that men exercise over them is illegitimate power. It's power to which they have no right, and therefore a tyranny.